Hi, welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're going to be talking about orchid conservation. Today is Earth Day. This day is very special because it focuses primarily on environmental issues and trying to address its problems. There is a lot of talk about climate change and saving the environment, but for today's episode, I'm going to focus primarily on orchids and their conservation. So to give a little background, we know climate change is happening, and as the climate shifts and the temperatures change, orchids are particularly vulnerable to those changes. Some orchids are so specialized that they grow on certain types of trees, or they have a very specific pollinator. And if those things change or diminish, then the populations also diminish. Now, losing one or two orchids does not sound like a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But keep in mind that they're a part of the larger ecosystem, and there is a chain reaction when we lose something in an ecosystem. Obviously, there needs something to replace it, but oftentimes with man-made activities, that doesn't necessarily help. Human activities are definitely accelerating the rate of extinction of not only plants and animals, and we definitely need to figure out ways in which we can sustainably coexist with the world around us. I know that there is a program to help protect our native orchid environment here in California, but I am not sure how that is really enacted. So I need to do a little bit more research in that area. So there are a few ways in which hobbyists and orchid lovers can help contribute to orchid conservation. So the first way, if you have some extra money to spare, is to donate. You can donate your money to orchid conservation programs and centers and research facilities. All of these things will help preserve either native habitats or provide research and funding to help learn more about these orchids. There is also a huge need to promote educational programs like funding for botanical majors or horticulture and botanists. We need more people to be interested in orchids so that we can figure out how best to conserve its habitat. I think on the list of interesting or financially fulfilling majors, I think botany and horticulture are pretty low on the list. So if we can do something to make that more viable and more sustainable in the future, then hopefully we'll see a flush of new blood into that, and hopefully we'll have new research into orchids. I think a lot of times there is a lot of missing information about orchids. We don't know a lot about them, and what we do know is very piecemeal. So I'm hoping that as we advance in our technology with gene sequencing and DNA barcoding, we can do a lot more in terms of understanding these wonderful plants. The other thing we can do is to grow and propagate lesser known or more uncommon species. As much as I love these beautiful hybrids and these very large and showy flowers, sometimes the best orchids that we can get are the ones that people know nothing about, and you can become the expert in that. While I find that most people tend to think of botanical gardens or other institutions as kind of the experts in the field for growing certain plants, they don't know everything, and sometimes they don't have the opportunity to discover or even to figure out how to grow something. And if you have the ability and time to do it and learn the challenges, then it can help researchers or it could help other people figure out how best to grow this plant. For example, there is a little known orchid here in the United States called the Koopowitz orchid or the helmet orchid. It's not very widely known in cultivation, but it's also considered endangered in some areas where they are found. So currently there is not a lot of information about how to grow this plant or how to take care of it. There is a small niche of growers that are really interested in this plant, and they created a Facebook group to help figure out how they grow these plants successfully. Some have been able to share care advice, media advice, ways in which to grow this orchid ex situ, which is out of its natural habitat. And hopefully there will be more groups like that that are able to document and record and observe the growth pattern of a specific orchid that may not be listed in cultivation or are not as fancy or as eye-catching as the ones that we see at the grocery store. There are a lot of orchid growers out there, so if everyone picks a very special or unique orchid that they decide to grow, whether it be a genus or a specific species, I think it would be be invaluable, because in this day and age with social media, knowledge can be found at your fingertips on the internet. And if we all put up a little bit of information out there, I think it would be quite beneficial just to have that out there. This is kind of piggybacking off of the Care Collab series that Nina of Ninja Orchids has done. I think it's really great that she's bringing along all these growers from around the world to share how they grow these plants in their different environments. And I would like to extend that to sharing how we can grow even more unique, unusual plants in our environments. And that will probably extend the interest and diversity of orchids that are out there. I know a lot of houseplant lovers are really into aroids right now, and they love all the beautiful leaf shapes and foliage. And if we can extend that to orchids, that would be even better, because while orchids are primarily known for their flowers, they have very unique foliage as well. And if we can really tap into that and start growing orchids for their foliage as well as their flowers, I think that would just be a huge benefit overall. If you don't have access to more uncommon species because of the nurseries or the country that you live in, that's totally okay. Another option is to look into the native orchids around you and where you live. Sometimes we may discover that we live in a place with a huge diversity of orchids that are just growing natively, and a lot of people seem to neglect them. Sometimes I think if a plant grows really well in its native habitat, people consider them more like weeds and don't really think of them as something special. But to the outsider and people outside of the country, it is very valuable indeed. So one way to help is to observe and document your local orchids nearby, just to see how it grows, what the populations are like, what the climate is like, what the geography is like, everything you can think of about how this orchid grows in the wild, in nature, or even by the roadside. You can just go a couple times a year to see the different growth stages of these plants and just document it. I think that's valuable information that we don't tend to see, because when it comes to scientists and botanists, they might go and visit a field site once a year, once every 10 years to keep track of how a population may be doing. Or they may just be collecting an orchid for documentation purposes, but they never come back. Having someone there all the time to document and see how these orchids progress is a huge boon. And I think that's something that's truly unique and special. There's a YouTube channel called Orchids and Finbos, and he kind of shows what the native orchid space is like in South Africa. I think it's really cool because he documents not only what's growing in his own personal collection, but what's out there in the nature preserves and in the areas where orchids grow in the wild. And that is something that's very unique and interesting, because there's no place on the planet quite like that place, and there's no place where those plants grow naturally right there. So it's great to see what ideal conditions are like, and then we can pull from that to mimic them in our own environments. I think it's really cool that there are things like orchid field trips out there where people can go to Borneo or Java or other places to see how orchids grow in the wild. Not all of us have the resources to go on a trip like that, much less have the time, resources, and health to be able to climb mountains, go on long hikes, and check for orchids in trees and other areas. I think going into the field and looking for orchids is a young person's adventure, and it's for the increased knowledge of the older people. I think the greatest minds in orchids tend to be older, since they have a lot of knowledge accumulated over the years, but all of the hunting, discovering, and observation have to be done by younger people, because I think orchids are increasingly harder to find and they tend to be in inaccessible places. If you have native orchids, document it, share it with the world, let people know everything you can, because that will definitely help and give information that may not be found elsewhere. Scientists, botanical institutions, botanical gardens, and all these other things are great for cataloging and describing all these plants, but they don't necessarily have the time and resources to fully dedicate and having a fully involved, thorough look into a specific orchid species or plant. Unless it has some huge commercial value or medicinal value or something of that sort, most orchids just tend to be documented, described, taken samples of, and maybe a picture or two, and that's the end of that orchid. You will never really see it elsewhere. It may not even end up in cultivation, and it'll just be there written down for posterity. Another thing that we should look out for is reducing our reliance on wild collected plants. Now, wild collected plants can be quite a controversial topic, and I understand its place in the commercial industry and with small breeders. But if you have the option to choose between a cultivated plant and a wild collected plant, I would strongly urge you to please choose a cultivated plant. This is kind of an imperfect solution since we don't always have the best tracking for some of these things, and it's not always possible to figure those things out. But if you can and you could trace back the origins of your plant, it is best to pick one that has been grown in a greenhouse environment. It would be great to have legitimate ways for wild collected plants to make it into industry in a safe and ethical way, but that tends to be fraught with a lot of problems and poaching, and there's just not enough resources to protect orchids to figure out what is a sustainable harvest and what is detrimental to the natural populations. There is so much to learn about this topic, and it's constantly growing and shifting. I've gotten a lot of this information from a 2001 book called Orchids and its Conservation by Koopowitz, and even though it is a 20-year-old book, I think it's still relevant now. I'm hoping that new technologies and new programs have been established in its place so that some of the things that he's talking about in the book are actually being addressed and we're finding solutions for. Obviously, with the state of how the orchid industry is now, there is a larger focus on mass producing plants. It is really interesting to see how orchids have definitely gained and risen in popularity, but a few chosen plants are the ones that everyone seems to know, while the vast majority still remain relatively obscure. If you have the opportunity to learn about orchids, please do. Please learn about conservation and try to get involved and see what are the possibilities that we can do to help protect orchids and the environment so that we have something to enjoy for many years to come. If you have any ideas or programs or things that you would like to share about how we can save orchids or even the environment, please share that in the comments. I'm going to give some links in the description about where I found my information and ways you can support, and I hope you have a great Earth Day. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel Attainable Green to follow along on my orchid growing journey. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!